In October 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than at almost any other point in history. For 13 tense days, the United States and the Soviet Union confronted each other over Soviet nuclear missiles secretly deployed to Cuba. American forces went on high alert. Soviet ships approached a U.S. naval quarantine. Military commanders prepared for possible invasion and airstrikes. And behind the scenes, American and Soviet leaders struggled to prevent a confrontation that could have escalated into a nuclear exchange. But the Cuban Missile Crisis did not begin in October 1962. Its roots stretch back several years into the Cuban Revolution, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, the growing Cold War rivalry between Washington and Moscow, and a secret nuclear missile deployment that changed the balance of power in the Caribbean. This is a quick run-through of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In January 1959, Fidel Castro's revolutionary forces overthrew the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. At first, the relationship between Castro's new government and the United States was uncertain, but it deteriorated rapidly. The Cuban government nationalized American-owned businesses and moved increasingly toward the Soviet Union. Washington responded with economic pressure, including a growing embargo. The confrontation reached a dramatic point in April 1961, when Cuban exiles backed and trained by the United States attempted to overthrow Castro's government at the Bay of Pigs. The invasion failed badly. The disaster strengthened Castro's position inside Cuba and convinced both Castro and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev that another American attempt to overthrow the Cuban government was possible. The Kennedy administration also began a covert campaign known as Operation Mongoose, designed to undermine and ultimately overthrow Castro's government. For Moscow, Cuba presented an opportunity. The Soviet Union could strengthen an important ally in the Western Hemisphere while potentially deterring another American invasion. There was also another consideration. The United States had nuclear-armed Jupiter missiles stationed in Turkey, close to the Soviet Union. Khrushchev believed that placing Soviet missiles in Cuba could help correct what he saw as a strategic imbalance. In the spring and summer of 1962, Khrushchev and Castro secretly agreed to the deployment of Soviet nuclear missiles to Cuba. Construction of missile sites began during the summer. The operation was carried out under extraordinary secrecy, but American intelligence was watching. U-2 reconnaissance aircraft were regularly photographing Cuba, looking for evidence of the growing Soviet military presence. By September, Kennedy publicly warned the Soviet Union against introducing offensive weapons into Cuba. The warning did not stop the deployment. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 aircraft flew over western Cuba. Its cameras captured photographs showing what appeared to be Soviet missile installations under construction. The photographs were analyzed by intelligence specialists. They revealed sites capable of hosting medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles. These weapons could potentially strike much of the continental United States. On the morning of October 16th, President John F. Kennedy was informed. He immediately faced an extraordinary decision. The United States had discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed on an island just 90 miles from the American coast. What should America do? The military proposed several possibilities. One was a massive airstrike against the missile sites. Another was an invasion of Cuba, but both carried enormous risks. A surprise attack might kill Soviet personnel and provoke retaliation. An invasion could lead to a direct war between the United States and Soviet Union, and nobody could know how far such a war might escalate. Kennedy therefore created a secret group of senior advisors known as ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. For several days, they debated America's response. Kennedy ultimately rejected an immediate airstrike. Instead, he chose a naval quarantine of Cuba. On October 22nd, Kennedy addressed the American people on television. He announced that the United States had discovered offensive nuclear missile sites in Cuba. He demanded that the missiles be removed, and he announced that American naval forces would prevent additional offensive military equipment from reaching Cuba. Kennedy deliberately used the word quarantine rather than blockade. A blockade could have been regarded as an act of war under international law. The quarantine was presented as a more limited measure, but the situation was still extremely dangerous. American military forces were placed on a heightened state of readiness. Bombers were prepared. Troops gathered in Florida. Naval forces moved into the Caribbean, and Soviet ships carrying military equipment continued toward Cuba. The possibility of war was becoming very real. For several days, the world waited. Would Soviet ships attempt to break the American quarantine? If they did, American forces would have to decide whether to stop them by force. Then, on October 24th, some Soviet ships slowed or turned around. The immediate confrontation at sea was avoided, but the missiles already in Cuba remained. Kennedy and Khrushchev now faced a much more complicated problem. Khrushchev sent messages defending the Soviet deployment. He argued that the missiles were intended to protect Cuba from another American attack. Kennedy insisted that offensive nuclear weapons could not remain on the island. Both leaders were now trying to appear firm without triggering a war, and neither had complete control over events. October 27th became known as Black Saturday. It was arguably the most dangerous day of the entire crisis. The U-2 aircraft was shot down by a Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missile, apparently without a direct order from Khrushchev. The incident demonstrated just how difficult it was for leaders in Moscow and Washington to control events on the ground. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson Jr., was killed. American military leaders urged stronger action. At the same time, another American U-2, conducting an air sampling mission, accidentally entered Soviet airspace near Alaska, creating another potential flashpoint. And beneath the surface of the crisis, something even more dangerous was happening. The Soviet Union had secretly deployed nuclear warheads and tactical nuclear weapons to Cuba. American intelligence did not know the full extent of these weapons. This meant that American leaders were making decisions without knowing exactly what Soviet forces in Cuba possessed. The danger was not simply that Kennedy or Khrushchev might deliberately order a nuclear attack. There was also the possibility that events could spiral out of their control. A local commander could make a decision. A warning could be misunderstood. A military confrontation could escalate faster than political leaders could stop it. The Cuban Missile Crisis was therefore not simply a test of courage. It was a test of whether two nuclear superpowers could control an increasingly unstable situation. On October 27th, Khrushchev publicly demanded that the United States promise not to invade Cuba in return for the removal of Soviet missiles. But a second message contained another demand. The United States should remove its Jupiter nuclear missiles from Turkey. Kennedy's advisors were divided. Some wanted to reject the Soviet demands and prepare for military action. Others believed that a negotiated settlement was the only way out. Kennedy agreed to the essential public terms: the removal of the Soviet missiles in return for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba, while privately agreeing that the Jupiter missiles in Turkey would be removed. The Jupiter missiles were already becoming obsolete, and their removal had been under consideration. They were subsequently withdrawn, but the private agreement with Moscow helped resolve the immediate crisis. But the secret nature of the arrangement was important. The United States did not publicly present the settlement as a direct exchange of missiles in Cuba for missiles in Turkey. The Soviets, meanwhile, agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would dismantle the missile installations and remove the missiles. The confrontation did not completely end that day, however. The U.S. quarantine remained in place until November 20th, after the remaining Soviet Il-28 bombers were also removed. The world had stepped back from the edge. For years, the Cuban Missile Crisis was often presented as a simple story. Kennedy stood firm. Khrushchev backed down. The Soviet missiles were removed. But the historical picture is more complicated. The Soviet deployment was partly motivated by the desire to protect Cuba from another American invasion, and partly by Khrushchev's desire to improve the Soviet strategic position. The United States, meanwhile, had its own nuclear missiles close to the Soviet Union, and Cuba itself was not simply a passive location for Soviet weapons. Castro wanted protection from the United States and was deeply concerned about the survival of his revolution. Later evidence also showed just how dangerous the situation had been. Soviet nuclear weapons were actually present in Cuba, including tactical nuclear weapons that American leaders did not know about. Had the United States invaded Cuba, the consequences could have been catastrophic. The immediate consequence was the removal of the Soviet missiles from Cuba. But the crisis also produced several longer-term changes. Kennedy and Khrushchev had experienced how quickly a confrontation between nuclear powers could move toward disaster. In the months that followed, Washington and Moscow made efforts to improve communications. In 1963, a direct communications link, popularly known as the Hotline, was established between the White House and the Kremlin. It was intended to make rapid communication between the two governments easier during future crises. Later in 1963, the United States, Soviet Union, and United Kingdom signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. The crisis also affected Khrushchev's political position. Although he had avoided war and achieved the removal of American missiles from Turkey, the secret agreement was not widely known at the time. His handling of the crisis became one of several issues contributing to his eventual removal from power in 1964. For Castro, the outcome was more complicated. Cuba had survived the immediate danger of an American invasion, but Castro was frustrated that the Soviet Union had negotiated over the missiles without giving Cuba a decisive role in the final settlement. The crisis also reinforced Cuba's dependence on the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains one of the most important events of the Cold War. It demonstrated the terrifying, destructive power of nuclear weapons. But perhaps its greatest lesson was not about military strength. It was about miscalculation. The crisis was filled with uncertainty, incomplete information, and misunderstandings. Kennedy did not know exactly what weapons were in Cuba. Khrushchev did not know exactly how Kennedy would respond. Military commanders on both sides were operating under enormous pressure, and events nearly escaped political control. The crisis therefore showed that nuclear deterrence could depend not only on the weapons themselves, but on communication, restraint, and the ability of political leaders to understand their opponents. The world survived the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it had come extraordinarily close to catastrophe. In October 1962, the fate of millions of people depended on decisions being made in Washington, Moscow, and Havana. And the most frightening lesson was perhaps the simplest. When nuclear weapons are involved, there may be no room for a mistake. If you found this story interesting, please like and subscribe to the Quick Run Through channel for more concise history explainers.